To offer some prayers. Imam C, you have the floor.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين وإن تستفتحوا قد جاءكم الفتح نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل والله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر وسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you very much, Imam C. That Bishop, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Lord God Almighty, we pray that by your powerful name, you will protect this nation, the Gambia. That under your powerful name, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the one who has authority all over humankind and all over your creation, we ask that you will grant that in this land, that all be learned to render tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due, and honor to whom honor is due. And we also pray that you will grant us in this nation, the Gambia, that we will learn to love each and every human person that you have placed in this land. For in love, hatred will disappear. In love, wickedness will disappear. In love, we will walk in unity as one people. And we ask that as we continue to bring out the truth in this TRRC, the Lord, your reconciliation power will filter throughout the land. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Bishop. With that, Council, are we ready with this morning's witness? If we are, you may proceed, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning to you all. The witness is in the waiting room. Can I kindly ask the usher to bring her in? Thank you.
I, Ndey Tapha Sosseh,
do swear that
do swear that
I'll speak the truth,
I'll speak the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mrs. Sosseh.
Good
How are you
morning.
today?
I'm good.
Thank you very much for appearing on such short notice to testify before the TRRC. I would first of all like to welcome you to the Commission. You already know my name. It's Haraja Balagay, and I will be the one questioning you on behalf of the Commissioners today. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. There is interpretation into the local languages, so into Fula, Mandinka, Wolof, and so it would be very helpful if you and I both speak slowly to allow the interpreters to do their work, and also to allow a few seconds in between our speeches so that there isn't any overlap speech. Additionally, in terms of my questions, if there's anything that's unclear or you would like me to repeat, please feel free to do so. For today's testimony, I will be asking you the usual questions about biographical information, your academic and professional background, which is relevant to your testimony. It is just so the commissioners understand who you are. We will then talk about your professional experience in the Gambia as part of your profession as a journalist. We will address a lot of issues within that topic, such as the death of Mr. Ndey Haidara. We will also talk about the case of the 7 journalists, ended up being 6 journalists after Mr. Saidi Khan was acquitted and discharged. We will also address your experiences as a journalist and other activities that you engaged in outside of the Gambia in relation to matters in the Gambia. Within that as well, we will discuss many topics, including the execution of the 9 inmates at Mile 2 Central Prison. We will also talk about your exile, statelessness, as well as attempts to extradite you back to the Gambia. We will talk about the interventions that you have made in relation to other journalists who have faced abuses and other individuals from within the Gambia. We will talk about the impact of all of this on you and your family, and then we will conclude with some recommendations from your perspective in relation to the media. So those are the range of topics that I intend to address with you this morning. Can we proceed with them?
Yeah, sure.
Just to ask you to draw the mic closer to you and just speak into the mic. Sometimes we do get guidance as to how well we're doing with that. So just to start, can you please state your full name?
Ndey Tapha Sosseh.
Can you tell us when and where you were born?
I was born in Banjul, I believe 12 Hagan Street, the Gambia, obviously.
And what is your date of birth?
27th July, 1979.
Can you take us a bit through your academic background? I mean, you have provided a copy of your CV, so if you would like to refer to it as well, I can provide you with a copy. But otherwise, please give us a background of the academic qualifications that you have, and then we will talk about the professional qualifications.
Okay, well, I went to primary school at the St. Joseph's Ex-People's Primary, now in Dow's, then St. Joseph's High School, where I had my O-levels, and then Marina International, where I did my A-levels. Then I worked for 2 years, but during this period, I had 2 certificates, I think one on health reporting and another on population and development reporting, organized by the Commonwealth Press Union. After that, I went to college in the UK, Warwickshire College.
So just before that, when did you finish high school?
1998, A-levels.
A-levels?
Yeah.
And then when did you go to the UK for further studies?
2000, September 2000.
You're just telling us that you went to Warwickshire, is that correct?
Yeah, Warwickshire College, where I first had a certificate in newspaper journalism and then a diploma in journalism as well. Then I enrolled in a master's program at the University of Central England, where I did a master's in international press journalism between 2002 and 2004.
But during the time that you were studying, you had already started working in the Gambia. Can you take us through your professional experience, at least up until today, if possible, but I will assist should you need that.
Okay, I'll do my best. I believe that in 1996, whilst waiting for my O-level results, I worked at the Radio 1 FM and then went back to school. In 98, I joined the Daily Observer in May or June of 1998.
What was your role at that time?
Well, I was an intern or a trainee reporter for about 3 months. And then during this time, I worked closely with the news editor and the editor-in-chief. So there was a position for sub-editor. And they thought that I could fill that role. So I was offered the position of sub-editor, but that I would continue writing. So I had a column as well, Women in Development, and was also writing other stories, news stories. And I believe I did that maybe for a year or a while, and then I was made assistant editor, a role which I had until I left for the UK.
So that would have meant that between 1998 and 1999, that's when you were sub-editor of the Daily Observer, and thereafter assistant editor and columnist between 99 and 2000.
Yeah.
And then you went for your further studies, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us what your role was as a sub-editor as well as an editor, assistant editor?
Well, as sub-editor, I mainly looked at articles that were already pre-selected by either the news editor or the assistant editor. At the time, journalists submitted their articles on paper, so it would mean editing on a sheet of paper before you handed it to the typist, who would then type the story which was to be edited by the senior editors at the time. I had little role in selecting the articles. I was basically editing articles that were already selected. As assistant editor, I would participate in the selection of articles and even send out journalists to cover events should we have news or receive information that events were taking place.
Can you tell us a bit more about what other roles you held after that, and that we'll come back to your time as editor and sub-editor?
Well, I believe that I was trainee, no, not a trainee. I was on attachment at the Birmingham Post whilst I was doing my master's. So I was writing as a journalist whilst I was in the UK as well.
And when you came back from the UK after concluding your studies, I believe it was your master's in journalism?
Yeah.
What position did you hold thereafter?
Well, just after submitting my thesis, I came back to the Gambia to do research on my thesis, and then went back to the UK. I was invited, I was called by Sheriff Bojang, who was just made managing director of the Daily Observer at the time, and who was a personal friend at the time, and who wanted me to come back to the Daily Observer as editor-in-chief. Initially, I had some reservation, and we had several conversations on this. He made quite a few phone calls. Because the Daily Observer at the time was seen to be pro-government, and I, having worked with Sheriff, also knew that he could be quite independent. And I told him that if he could guarantee that I would have total control of the editorial independence of the paper, then I would come, which he did. He was willing to, and so I agreed to come back. So I came back, I believe, in June of 2004 to be editor-in-chief of the Daily Observer.
And how long did you serve as editor-in-chief of the Daily Observer?
Maybe 7 months. It didn't last long. I was suspended after the death of Dada Hyderah. I believe, well, there was never a written suspension, but I believe it was for the role I played in taking part in GPU activities during the period. It was a verbal suspension, so I'm assuming here that it was related to that because it was immediately after.
And we will come back to the details of those events. But after you were suspended from your position as editor-in-chief of the Daily Observer, did you take on any other roles within the Gambia?
Yes, I worked as communications officer at the MRC, but I left of my own accord because having worked in the newsroom and now being a communications officer, I felt there was no real challenge. Even though the pay was like 10 times better, I decided to quit and get fully involved in the union activities.
And that would be the activities of the Gambia Press Union?
Yes.
Can you tell us what position you held in the Gambia Press Union, if at all?
Well, shortly after Data Hydera died, the Gambia Press Union held a congress in 2005. It would be May or March, I'm not so sure. But I was elected Secretary General. I was approached by senior members of the Gambia Press Union who proposed that they wanted me to stand for the position of Secretary General, and I stood unchallenged, so I was elected Secretary General of the Press Union.
And how long did you serve as Secretary General of the GPU?
3 years.
So 2005 to 2008?
Exactly.
Did you hold any other position after that?
Yes. At the Congress of 2008, I was elected President of the Gambia Press Union.
And how long did you hold that position?
Till 2011, I believe.
I know that you engaged in a lot of activities after you left the Gambia, but for now I will just focus on your time within the Gambia, and then we'll come back to the other positions that you held outside of the Gambia. For the most part of your experience and your engagement as a journalist in the Gambia, you worked at the Daily Observer.
Yes.
Is that correct? Can you just tell us from your vantage point what the environment was like for journalists at the time? And I'm referring to 1998, thereabouts, or even 1996, when you did some work at Radio NFM. But from 1998 onwards, as a journalist at the Daily Observer, including all the various roles you held, what was your experience in terms of journalists under the Yahya Jammeh regime at the time?
In 1996, I was much younger, and Uncle George was very, very protective of me, and I did not leave the radio station much.
That would be George Christensen,
yes, George
the
Christensen, the late George Christensen, yeah. And so I didn't leave the radio station much. He made me read some news, but he was very protective, possibly because he knew also what pertained outside. But I knew at a very early age that I wanted to be a journalist, and I can be very restless if I don't do anything, so I decided that I needed a job whilst I was waiting for my results and eventual acceptance for A-levels. So I would not be able to really assess the situation at this time. But much later, I remember when I went to the Daily Observer, I worked to the offices of the late Theophilus George, who's also a personal family friend, and I told him that I wanted a job. This was 1 week after taking my A-level exams, and he said, "What kind of job do you want?" I said, "Well, I want to be a journalist, and I think I need some job experience." And he tried to talk me out of it because I guess he knew that the situation was very tense at the time. And he said, "I can find you any job that you want, but I think this is not really the ideal job for you, being a young woman at this time." And so we were having this conversation, and I asked him to take me on a tour of the Daily Observer. This was the first time that I met the TRRC's Babagale Jallo and Ndey Jawo. And so when we went to the office where Ndey Jawo was, he was seated to the right on the desk of the news editor. And I told him, "Well, I want to be a journalist, but my uncle here thinks that I shouldn't be." And he said, well, why not? Do you have any experience? So I told him what I did at Radio 1, but that I had just finished my A-level exams. And he asked me to bring an article the next day about my school, which I did. And then he said, I think that you would make a perfect journalist, so why don't you come start working? When can you start? I said, today. And I worked the whole day, and then later I told my mom, I have a job. So this is basically how I started as a journalist, and all of them, I would say, were very protective given the context at the time. I think I had just joined after they were detained at the NRA, and they had asked Giran Senghor and Aliou Badara Sow to be taking me to the courts and doing rounds with me. And Giran would be telling me about the mosquito-infested NIA room. I guess they were just testing how resilient I was and whether or not I was sure I wanted to be a journalist. And I said, well, that was the story, actually. You should have written a story about the mosquitoes. And I decided to stay, and I stayed for another 2 years.
Perhaps before you delve further into the context at the time, maybe this is a good place for you to tell us about your motivation for wanting to be a journalist.
Well, I've always liked basically sharing a story and having a conversation with people. But because I talk very, very fast, I thought at a very early age that I would not be a very good broadcast journalist. And in a way, I felt that I expressed myself better in writing. So I knew at some point that I was going to be a journalist. Initially, I thought I was going to go to law school first, but definitely I was going to be a journalist, maybe a lawyer defending journalists at some point, because there were so many journalists who were arrested and detained and who had horrible experiences. So I did contemplate going to law school, but mainly to be a defender, if you want to put it that way, of journalists and free expression advocates. But being in the media at that time, I also realized that there were very few people who were trained to be media personnel, and I challenged myself that I would do things differently. I wanted to be a trained journalist. I wanted to be a professional, so I had to go to journalism school. But in the meantime, I decided to work and stayed on to work because I really enjoyed it, and put off university for 2 years.
So you were telling us that in the beginning, you weren't so aware of the context regarding journalists. Yes, you had heard of some arrest, but tell us, when you started working at the Daily Observer, what did you notice in terms of the conditions under which journalists worked in the Jammeh era?
Well, I knew that colleagues were picked up routinely, and I heard of names of other journalists who were at the Daily Observer before me, who were foreign nationals who were harassed a lot. I think when I just started, they still had security personnel outside the gates of the Daily Observer, and that you had to give your identity card or something like that. This I remember at the beginning. But as I said, I really had not captured the magnitude of or the seriousness of what these threats meant. And in a way, I was really cushioned or cocooned by senior journalists who had very few women who were in the newsrooms and who did everything possible to make sure, I guess, that I was protected. I was never sent to cover technically dangerous events, or I never covered Jammeh, for example. The only time that I was at an event that Jammeh was at some ceremony related to the UTG for the first time. Much later, other issues would come up. I had my column, which was called Women in Development, and because of the column, I traveled across the country. In a weird way, I found that government officials were overly nice to me. Maybe they tried to corrupt my conscience. But at that point in time, on a personal level, between 96 and 98, personally, I did not. But obviously, other people faced threats and were harassed.
And it would be a good point to focus more on your experience once you got to a more senior position within the Daily Observer. So when you became sub-editor, assistant editor, and then culminating in your position as editor-in-chief when you returned from your studies. Can you just tell us, from your perspective also as a female in leadership at that time, what your perspective was on what was happening in terms of interactions between journalists and security forces, for example?
Well, after Ndey was sacked and Baba resigned, I had like more responsibilities, right? So
These would be D.A. Jawo and Baba Galede.
yeah. So I had developed a very strong relationship with reporters who felt somehow that they were being censored. And I've forgotten some of their names, but there were two in particular who would always show me stories that they had and tell me that since you're in charge on Thursday, this is for the Friday newspaper, we're going to keep our stories for you. And this was possibly a good thing financially because the paper was sold out the whole time. Every time we published the Friday Observer, it was sold out. But also I had a few instances where I was told that senior officials were not happy. This would have been on a Friday publication. And as I said, friends or so-called friends, people who were really nice to me would come and say that my boss was not happy with the story. And I would always ask them to write a rejoinder. I had not gone to journalism school, but having learned from people who were much more experienced, I realized that people had the right to say their side of the story, but I would tell them to put it in writing and that we would publish it and give it the same magnitude that we gave the story that they weren't happy about.
So I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. There was a sense of self-censorship for some reporters,
Yeah.
and some of them would actually withhold their stories until you were present on Thursday in order to print stories that were somewhat controversial on Friday. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then in terms of some of the stories you approved, you actually received feedback that some people were not happy with those stories. Can you give us examples of those?
Well, I remember once a protocol officer from the Office of the Vice President who used to work with my mom and up to this time was quite nice to me, and I used to interview her. This time I was supposed to interview her. She was busy traveling, but she said, send me the questions, and she actually responded in writing. But after this particular incident, she never responded to my requests for interviews. So we had the story from elsewhere, which they weren't very happy about, and the protocol officer told me that she wasn't happy about the story. So I said, well, you have a right to respond, and if you do, it will be published. They never did, and I never got any feedback, so I guess they just decided to do a blackout on me.
So who decided that they weren't happy with your story?
Well, the protocol officer told me clearly that the vice president wasn't happy with the story.
Who was the vice president at that time?
Ndey.
You said thereafter you believe that there was some sort of blackout in relation to you. What do you mean by that?
Well, we had quite a nice working relationship, and as I said, access to information when I needed clarifications, because as editor, it was also your job to make sure that journalists reported accurately. So sometimes you would have to cross-check, especially when it was supposedly sensitive. They would respond positively to phone calls that I made, cross-checking stories and stuff like that. But after that, that didn't happen again.
So you've given us some examples of intimidation and harassment in terms of security officials being stationed at the Daily Observer, some sort of either self-censorship or reporters withholding their stories until you were in charge in order to print controversial stories. What about any attempts to directly interfere with the editorial content? Did that occur?
At this point in time, I was the assistant editor, so I really wouldn't know. At no point beyond this particular incident and the few others where you've had senior government officials say, but you know, our boss really thinks that you're doing a great job, but you should be softer and stuff like that. Beyond that, at a personal level, I never was questioned as to why I took a particular position or published a particular story, never.
What about at the time when you became editor-in-chief? Were there any instances of any direct interference?
Again, not directed at me, possibly sometimes at my managing director, who was also a personal friend. He was my boss, but a personal friend, and he knew that I could be erratic sometimes, and I could actually possibly write a story that I was told not to write a story. So he never directly told me not to write a story. He would convince me to wait on a story maybe, or try to get more information, but he never directly told me not to write something. And I wouldn't have listened anyway, so.
Well, you've told us that there were some reporters who wanted to write those controversial stories that had to wait until you were present. Can you just give us an idea of what kinds of sentiments were being expressed by journalists in relation to their interaction with the regime?
Well, we'll take it at two different periods. When I was editor-in-chief, I knew at the time, before taking up the appointment, that management had changed, that when critical journalists left, by critical journalists, I mean people who were open-minded and who would basically dissect information to try to get to the bottom of it. I went to study, and things had changed. The paper had really watered down its style of journalism, and even the editorial policy kind of like slanted in favor of the authorities. So when I was asked to come back, this was one of the issues that I raised with the then MD, and I said that when I joined the Observer before, it was because of the style of journalism, and this was what I intended to continue. And he said that, well, he was looking forward to that. So when I came back, this is exactly what we did from the beginning, and I think that for many journalists who were possibly doing some self-censorship, they felt there was this new era within the Daily Observer where they could express themselves freely within and outside the Daily Observer. Because we had this one rule, and it was that you had to speak and write the truth. And I remember one incident where a journalist, definitely, because management had changed, this was when I was assistant editor, it was now Sari and Sosseh who was the MD, and there was a particular reporter who wrote a story but had embellished some of the facts. Fortunately, it was not about the government, but an embassy, and they had contacted the MD, and he called me. And when I called the reporter, he admitted that he had made a part of the story, and I told him that he was going to write an apology, which he did. And as I said, I had not yet been to journalism school, but these were principles and values. I guess I was raised also within an environment where speaking the truth and facing the consequences for lying were the order of the day. So I published the apology to the embassy as well.
So would you say that even though the environment was one of harassment and intimidation, there was still some kind of resistance in terms of writing some critical stories?
Certainly. It was something that I wanted to promote, and it was something that was in most of the journalists, but dependent on what type of management and what type of leadership there was. People had to adapt and find other survival tactics. As I said, because I took my appointment quite seriously, because I felt I was young, and I was the first woman to be appointed editor-in-chief of a newspaper. And from that angle, I felt that my image mattered a lot, and I could not tone down because I was a woman. I guess I felt I had something to prove as well.
So considering some of the steps that you took, what was your view of the president at the time, Yahya Jammeh, as well as just the system as a whole?
Well, I always saw Yahya Jammeh as an attention-seeking lunatic. I'm sorry.
Sorry, can you say that again and into the mic? I can't.
An attention-seeking lunatic, right? It's because he was the president, but I don't think he realized the importance of the role that he had, which led him to doing or getting involved in so many other things, but activities of running the state. So I never took him seriously. For me, he was a clown. And I never was really interested in what he was doing, be it treatments, be it farming, be it whatever he did. For me, it was just him again at his attention-seeking tricks. So unless it was about the state, maybe a State of the Nation address at the National Assembly, and possibly UTG matters, all other things that he did, I found not to be the role of the president. Possibly as a journalist, I was unfair because I had to give all sides the fair attention that they deserved, but I don't think I did with him. I didn't have the time of the day for him.
Because I'm trying to understand what informed some of the steps and the measures you took. So this is probably a good time to get into the event surrounding the death of Mr. Ndey Haidara. At that time, were you working at the Daily Observer in December 2004?
Yes, I was the editor-in-chief of the Daily Observer.
Can you tell us the circumstances surrounding that incident, what you know, as well as the reaction from your side?
Okay, well, I remember the night before Ndey died, I had to drive past the Point newspaper to get to my mother's residence. And I saw his Mercedes parked out. So there was always two things that went to my head, because I'm quite competitive. So I thought that, oh, maybe they have a major story, like that I didn't have, because my paper for the next day was not so big, right? So I was thinking, what story do they have? And then I said, well, it doesn't really matter because we've already gone to the press, right? So I went home not thinking anything of it. And then I went to sleep. But at this point in time, I used to work like 15-hour days sometimes. So when I get home after eating and everything, I would unplug the phones, this was the landline, and get to bed, which is what I did this night as well. So apparently everybody was calling me when the news broke that Ndey was shot, and nobody could get me. And then Sheriff Bojan came home, and he was hitting hard on my mom's gate. Ndey, where are you? I said, what? He said, everybody's calling you. I said, yeah, but what happened? And he said, Ndey died, and that he was going to the mortuary. So I said, I'm coming with you. And he said, no, I don't think you should go to the mortuary. And I said, why? He said, I don't think you want to see that. So I got dressed quickly, went to the office, went to the GPU, I believe, because there was some sort of emergency GPU meeting. At this point in time, I was not an executive member, but I felt that the only appropriate place to go would have been the press union anyway. So I found Demba Jao, Madi Sise, who was an executive member at the time but not the president, Chano Jalo, Suwaibu Konate, I believe, Samsar, at the GPU. And they had this emergency meeting in which I participated, even though I was not an executive member. And they decided they were going to have a members' meeting and decided on steps that were to be taken by the media to show our grief, but also to stand in solidarity with Ndey's family. From there, the men were to go, I believe, to the mortuary or to the family, but I later went home and then went to his family compound. So at this meeting, we agreed that the media would have a blackout, and that we would organize a solidarity march. So I believe also we wrote to the National Security Council requesting a meeting. I believe these were the decisions that were taken that day.
At that point, were there any suspicions as to what had led to Mr. Ndey Haidara's death?
Yes and no. We really could not have known at this point in time, but also there were threats to other senior journalists. So even if we did not believe it was the state, we also could not say it was not the state, right? So when we agreed at this meeting that this was going to take place, I remember the senior editors told me, but Ndey, we would understand if the Daily Observer does not allow you, if your management does not allow you to do a news blackout and to take the positions that we are taking, which meant that we would publish the next day a one-pager, all of us, just with stories on data, and to also inform the Gambian public that we were going on a news blackout. And I said I would. Like, there was absolutely no way that my management could stop me. I did not even think of informing them anyway, so.
Why did the other papers believe that your management would be unlikely to allow you to institute a blackout because of the murder of Ndey Haidara?
Well, the ownership won, and secondly, that management would not want to, much as they would allow me to freely express myself and try to turn around the slant of the paper, they would not want to go that far. This was the general feeling.
What do you mean by the ownership? Who are you referring to, or what was it about the ownership?
Well, the Daily Observer was bought at some point by Amadou Samba, as indicated by previous witnesses, and I'm not sure whether Baba Job was in prison at this point in time, but at some point, I believe this is when I was assistant editor, he was regularly also at the Daily Observer and could walk into any office.
That is Baba Job?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
do you know what his role, position was at the time in relation to the Daily Observer?
There were insinuations that he was now the owner, but as I said, I don't know. I don't know whether it existed on paper, a transfer of ownership. I really do not know, and I believe I had raised this with the managing director, because I had an incident with him, which was not harsh given the circumstances and what other journalists faced, but he did ask me whether I was a Gambian, and he greeted me he did not greet me, he talked to me in Mandinka, which I don't speak, by the way, and I told him I don't understand Mandinka, and he said, "Are you not a Gambian?" And I said, "But from where I'm standing, I think I look more Gambian than you." And
this was Baba Job, right?
Job. And he said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "It doesn't matter who you are. You just walked into my office, opened the door, started talking to me. You did not greet me. And then you're asking me whether I'm a Gambian." So he actually banged the door and he left. Then the Daily Observer secretary at the time asked me, "Do you know who this guy is?" And I said, "No, I have no clue." And she said, "This is Baba Job. Everyone is scared of this guy." I said, "Not me." And then I guess my boss later told him that apparently I had some mental issues, which I don't, right? So, but this was the only incident that I had with him. And after that, we never spoke. He would come in and out of the Daily Observer, and we never greeted, and we never spoke. And same as Amadou Samba as well. I think I spoke to him once. He came and he asked me where Sheriff was, because the office I was using at this point in time as editor-in-chief was Sheriff's previous office before he moved to the MD's office. So I guess some people still assumed this was his office. But in both instances, I spoke to the purported owners only once, and they never spoke to me again, I guess because I was apparently rude. I have no clue, but they never spoke to me again, even though we met on several instances.
So at this meeting with the various editors-in-chief, the GPU executive, the sentiments were expressed that they would understand if you don't go ahead and support the blackout that all the other papers were going to engage in. What happened after that?
Well, I was determined to stand in solidarity with my colleagues, whatever the consequences would be for me. So I decided against telling the management, but had a meeting with my sub-editors or assistant editors at the time, Malik Moub and Pakemo Jaju, and I told them of the GPU decision and my intention to do so at whatever cost. But I had the strong feeling that having said that at some point, because my MD was also a journalist, he could actually, under pressure, go behind me and publish the newspaper. So I decided to go to the printers and tell them about the GPU decision and ask if they could help me not publish the paper if they decided to work behind the scenes, which the lead printer told me he would do, and they did.
So the Daily Observer as well supported the blackout, essentially?
Yes.
Did anything happen to you as a result of that decision?
Yeah, I was suspended. My boss came to my house because we weren't working, so I gave the journalist a week off and stayed home, and essentially was participating in other GPU activities. I think during this time I participated in a meeting between the GPU executive and the National Security Council, chaired by the Vice President. At the meeting, there were security chiefs, the former Minister of Information, Amadou Skadrajane, and we became friends from that day. There was D.A. Jao, Madi Sise, George Christensen, Suwaiba Konates Hamsar. I can remember these. Possibly there were more individuals, but these people were there.
So can you tell us what happened at that meeting with the National Security Council? What was the objective of the meeting, and what were the conclusions at all from that meeting?
Well, the GPU executive wanted to express concern about the state of security of journalists and media houses. The Vice President told us that what we wanted was practically impossible because the state could certainly not provide a uniformed policeman alongside each and every journalist, which was not what we wanted. What we wanted was to convey this message that journalists received death threats, that journalists were harassed, because sometimes journalists would go to events and actually be harassed by security personnel. We also told them of our intention to march, which was a direct no, and eventually they got back to us, and because there was a lot of international media attention as well, and GPU leadership made it known that the march would not take place because we were not granted permission. So at the last minute, I think the day before the march, they said we could go ahead, but that we had to follow a particular route, just from the arch straight to the police headquarters and then to the Ministry of Interior.
In that meeting with the National Security Council, was the issue of investigations discussed, like
Yes.
investigations into Mr. Data Hydera's death?
Yeah.
What was the reaction of the state to that?
Well, that it was being investigated. This is what we were told. This was a few days after Data died. So at this point in time, I don't believe that the GPU was actually asking for foreign help. We had assumed that the state would take its responsibility to investigate, but it was serious because this was now the apex of crimes against journalists, and we knew that globally, generally, crimes against journalists are not investigated, or even if they are, the perpetrators go unpunished. So we did not want this to happen in Data's case, and we had said this to them from day one.
So you said that they placed a number of conditions in terms of the march, solidarity march that you wanted to hold for Mr. Data Hydera, including specific route that you were to follow. Was there any other condition? What about in terms of who could participate?
Yeah, they said that only journalists were allowed to take part in this march, and that we could not be chanting slogans, in short, that it had to be a silent march.
And do you know why they wanted to limit it only to journalists participating in the Solidarity March? After all, Mr. Data Hydera was a Gambian.
I have no clue, but later it emerged that they had orders to shoot at protesters, at the slightest error on our part. So I guess they did not also want to make the mistake of killing ordinary Gambians who were just showing solidarity. This is my assumption, right?
But did you later hear information confirming that point, that they had orders to shoot at demonstrators if they made noise?
Yes.
Can you tell us how you found out about that?
Well, I believe the army commander at the time was Vincent Jatta. He was sacked immediately after that, apparently because he did not give the order to his men. They had surrounded us, actually. It was like we were going to war. Coming into Banjul, you had tanks, military positioned at all angles coming from the arch along the High Court. It was like just going to war. And I was a bit worried because apparently my family had also received this information. And I was alone at home, I believe, because my mother was not in town. But she had called me from the UK and she said, okay, I know I can't tell you not to go because you will go. But if you go, can you please not be in front? And I said, I won't. Then she saw the images, I guess on BBC or somewhere. And I was right there in front in the middle. And she said, you would have been the first to die, possibly. But I had to stand in solidarity. I felt that as an editor-in-chief, it could have been me. I guess this was the feeling that I had, that it could have been me. And I wasn't close to Data before I went to study. But whilst doing my thesis, he was very, very helpful because I did my thesis on the National Media Commission Act, the case for self-regulation. So I had to come back and I went through articles that he wrote. And he helped with resource persons that I could contact and all of that. So we had developed a close bond. When I was appointed editor-in-chief as well, the GPU issued a statement welcoming me because I guess I was the only woman in their midst. So Data kind of became like a mentor. And sometimes we would exchange notes because I knew that he had a very good network and a way of confirming information as well. So I used him sometimes to confirm information that I thought was sensitive. So in a way, this was personal for me. It was very, very personal. It could have been me anyway.
So after the journalists conducted the Solidarity March, at the same time you had the media blackout. How long did that blackout last?
I believe it was meant for 7 days. Yeah.
And after that, let's focus on the 1 year celebration. Well, I shouldn't say celebration, 1 year commemoration of the death of Mr. Data Haidara. Can you tell us about the events surrounding that commemoration?
Well, at this point, I was the Secretary General of the Gambia Press Union, and we had discussed with the West African Journalists Association, the IFJ, Article 19, and other. So we decided to make it into a regional event, the African Editors Forum. So they were all to converge in Banjul to have a conference, a 2-day conference, I believe, and then visit the site of Data, where Data was shot. Go to his family. I believe I was about 6 months pregnant at the time, and then when we went to the site, there was a big police presence there, and we were told that we could not access the site. But prior to this, we had invited the then minister to give the opening remarks, which she never did. She didn't turn up. But this was also a message that we wanted to show the whole world, because we knew they wouldn't come anyway. But we wanted to show the world that the government was not listening. So we decided to invite them and put their name on the high table and show that they were absent.
So this was a year after, and you were trying to go to the site, meaning the cemetery, or the site of where the attack occurred.
Yeah, where Data was shot, yeah.
So to a public place, essentially.
Yes, it's behind the PIU offices, I believe, in Canifing.
And so you were prevented from doing that. Was there any kind of scuffle or any kind of difficulties or engagement between your side and the authorities?
Oh, yes. There was Madi. Madi was the GPU president. I believe Ramatullah Chare, this is when she had her equipment, I can't remember what it was, camera or recorder smashed. But we
Sorry, just Madi, you're referring to Madi Sosseh.
Madi M.K. Sosseh, yeah.
Please continue, yeah.
There were also journalists from French-speaking countries who were used to organizing marches and protests, so they could not understand. So I remember the former president of Waja, he's late now, Ibrahim Famakan Coulibaly, he was telling me, I am the president of the West African Journalists Association. So these, especially the French-speaking colleagues, could not understand why we could not just access the site and take pictures, particularly given that, like, for example, when we go to Burkina, when we organize events in Burkina, we go to the cemetery of the late Norbert Zongo. We go to the site where he was killed. There are pictures of the site of how he was shot, exposed at the press center. So I think they were actually into a culture shock, if you want to put it that way, that we really could not do that.
Meaning what was perfectly normal and acceptable in their countries, other West African countries, was not acceptable in
Certainly.
the Gambia. Did anything else happen during that particular event, apart from the assault on the reporter, Ramatullah Chare? Did anything else happen to any of your members?
I believe I left earlier. As I said, I was about 6 months pregnant, and there were other female senior journalists, like Amit Juf Cole was there, I believe, Fatou Jan Senghor, and they insisted, because I was beginning to get very, very irritated, that we think that you should go, we'll handle this, we think that you should go and take a break at the offices, and we'll meet you there, or back to Kairaba Hotel where we had the event. So they actually ushered me into a car. I guess they believed that something was going to happen to my pregnancy, which I don't think. But anyway, they actually forced me to leave. So when they came back, we had conversations about what happened. But I was not. I was present maybe for the first 15 minutes.
So this was a year after the actual death had taken place, suspicions that it was a murder. Can you tell us anything about any attempts to investigate the murder that you're aware of? Did the government make any attempts to investigate the murder?
Well, a few years down the line, and this is despite repeated attempts by the GPU to meet senior government officials to talk about the data case. I believe a few years down the line there was some ridiculous NIA report that stated our possible motives as to why somebody would want to kill Data with some sort of, I guess, autopsy report. It's been a while now, but yes, there was some sort of attempt to explain what happened, but blaming Data for having been killed.
What was the reaction of other journalists to that report, including yourself? How did the journalists feel about that report essentially blaming the victim himself for his own death?
Well, it was unsettling, if you want to put it that way, because I've always had the view personally that no matter who you are, the state has the responsibility for each and every Gambian, irrespective of your political affiliation or opinion. So if something of that magnitude could happen right next to a security unit, and the state cannot come up with possible conclusions. This was the best time that they should have invited, possibly for us, the MI5 or an international security institution to help them, because I believe that maybe they could not independently interpret what happened. But at the same time, there was a strong feeling among the media community. But we were careful because we had no proof at this point in time to accuse the government. Years later, maybe you want to come to this later, I met with a former security personnel who actually confirmed to me that it was indeed the government the president himself who ordered the killing of Data Haidar.
And we will come to that. Prior to you receiving that information from the individual who told you that the murder of Data Hyder was ordered by then President, was there any comment by the President at the time in relation to Mr. Data Hyder's murder?
I can't remember. I don't believe so, but I know for a fact that he was not happy, that there was always a photo on newspaper, newspaper, the lead page of the newspaper asking who killed Data Hyder, that he did not want to see that. He was not happy that we were still asking who killed Data.
Did you come to find out about an interview that was conducted by GRTS, I believe it was Mr. Keva Dibba, in which he asked the President at the time about his reaction, I believe, on the death of Mr. Data Hyder? Do you recall that?
Yeah, this would be much later, in 2009. Yes, there was, but I was not in town. I had actually, I was still GPU president, but I had taken up also another position within the West African Journalists Association, which required my presence for long periods in Mali. So at this point in time, I was in Bamako, and I received a call from Buya Jammeh. Before I left, we had set up a very small monitoring or observatory unit, if you want to call it that, at the GPU. And Buya called me in the evening, I guess just after the interview, to ask her whether I watched the interview. I said no. And he said, well, I'm sure you want to listen to this, because the President made some very disparaging remarks about Data. So I decided to connect online, and I can't remember whether I watched this on GRTS or somewhere else, but I did. And initially I was shocked, so I couldn't sleep. And I normally write better at night and when I'm furious. So I decided to draft a letter, which I would send to the GPU executive, an open letter to the President, which is what I did.
At that point, why did you feel that it was important to write such a response, essentially, to the President's comments?
Well, as I said earlier, I felt he was abdicating his responsibility of leadership. He was the head of state of the country, and this was a security matter at that, and he claimed to take security issues very seriously. So the fact that somebody could be shot in the middle of the road and nothing comes out of it, instead the head of state takes it to be normal for him to make disparaging remarks, did not take away the responsibility of the state from investigating. And I also felt that he was threatening us not to talk about issues like that. So the reaction was, one, to remind him of his responsibility and that of the state, and secondly, in defiance, that if you don't want us to ask, we will keep asking, and we will keep asking until we get answers.
So after you drafted essentially a statement responding to his comments, can you tell us what happened to that statement? Did it go through a process before it was issued?
Yes, I sent it to the entire GPU executive.
To interrupt you, can you just bring the mic a bit closer and maybe push it slightly down?
Is it good?
The
down?
Actual, yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So I sent it to the GPU executive by email. Before I left as president of the GPU, another mechanism that I instituted was like an elders group, and you could see this in pictures. I always consulted senior journalists. So I believe I would have copied the late Waibu Konate and Samsa. At that point in time, D.A. Jawa was not here, possibly Madi Sise, but I tried to reconnect with more seasoned and more experienced journalists, and we had this in place, this mechanism in place, that they would also be consulted on matters that we thought were particularly sensitive. And this was, in my view, because I knew that there would be a reaction. I did not expect it to go that far, but I expected a reaction. So yes, we did consultations across the board.
We heard from Mr. Buya Jammeh's testimony yesterday that when the statement came from you, it was considered quite harsh. I believe that's the word he used. I'm not too sure. But it went through an editing process.
Yeah.
So in the end, the statement that was published, did it come from you, or was it a combined effort, meaning the GPU executive were involved?
Well, I was the author, but it was a GPU statement, yes.
I have a copy of that statement. Unfortunately, I have an electronic version, and it's from its publication in the Point newspaper. I wanted to read a couple of paragraphs just to give a sense of what the statement contained, because we have been hearing about the statement, but we don't know exactly what's in it. So this was from the Point newspaper, and it's titled, GPU Reacts to Jammeh's Statement on Data Hyderabad Press Freedom. This statement was issued on Monday, the 15th of June, 2009. We've had a few witnesses testify to that as well. And it states, the Gambia Press Union wishes to express its shock and disappointment over the inappropriateness of the provocative statement of the head of state, President Jammeh, on GRTS, Tuesday night in relation to the death of veteran Gambian journalist, the late Data Hyderabad. It is rather unfortunate, and the union is indeed saddened, that the second time the head of state has so chosen to discuss the death of Data Hyderabad. He again has dwelled on the issue of character assassination and ridicule. It goes, I've skipped a few paragraphs, but it goes on to state that the union need not remind President Jammeh that it is difficult to presume that the Gambia government is concerned over the death of Data Hyderabad unless and until the Gambian government and its relevant security institutions are seen to be determined and resolved to seriously commit themselves in a professional manner to embark on investigating the events that led to the death of our dear colleague and brother. We also wish to bring to the attention of the head of state that the government of the Gambia and its relevant security apparatus have the primary responsibility to ensure the protection of each and every Gambian life, and therefore the murder of any Gambian should be an issue of paramount concern, and curbing such a menace a priority. Mere statements or speculations and ridicule regarding the events leading to the death of Data Hyderabad cannot and will not be accepted as exoneration of the Gambian government, neither by the union, international journalist associations, the Hyderabad family, or other interested parties. The death of any Gambian, more so one who was most vocal on issues of human rights, freedom of expression, and the development of the country in general, even if it meant clashing with the powers that be, can only be deemed suspicious until such time that the state can logically, reasonably, factually, and forensically, and within the shortest possible period, prove otherwise. We demand an investigation of fact and forensics spearheaded by the Gambia government. Should the relevant government institutions not have the resources or wherewithal to carry on with the investigations, we at the Gambia Press Union think it is time that you publicly admit that and invite other states and international policing and security institutions, such as Interpol, who already have a desk at the police headquarters, to take over the investigations. It goes on. I'll also skip to another paragraph, but we will provide the full version to the commissioners. It goes on. The president, the venom with which you spoke about websites with a picture of the slain journalist and the slogan, "Who killed Data Hyderabad," is alarming. We are very much aware that the issue be kept alive, and until such a time that his killers are brought to book, this slogan and its accompanying image will remain on the website of the union, and that even then we will coin a statement fitting to forever haunt the perpetrators of this heinous crimes. The killing of Ndey Haidara, if nothing else, has only strengthened the resolve of true journalists to remain steadfast, truthful, and committed to speaking in defense of the weak and the vulnerable. It goes on, but I think that provides an idea of what the statement contains, and we will provide the full statement to the commissioners. What was the reaction to such a statement?
Well, as I said, I wasn't on the ground, but when it was published initially by the Fourier newspaper, my family members tell me that they received phone calls. My aunties, did you see what Ndey wrote? And they would say, no. Well, my grand aunt, who's here present, always buys a newspaper every morning, so she also saw it. And they had expected a reaction that day. And some people who did not know that I was already in Mali were telling my family, tell her to run. She should run for her life. As I said earlier, I come from a family that's quite vocal on issues within the family and outside. So most of my family members did not really see what was wrong. Close family members did not see what was wrong with the statement. And then nothing happened all weekend. So there was, I guess, relief. But within the union, we were exchanging emails. And some papers had an issue carrying the paper. So there was carrying the PR. So there was some back and forth on this. And then the Point decided also to carry it, because I also believe there was no reprisal. So they carried it on the Monday. And this is when all hell broke loose. Apparently, they went to the GPU first and asked for me. And at this point in time, I had some element of security training from Amnesty International. So I never really said where I was traveling out of the country when I was. I would say I'm going to Dakar, when in fact I was going to Guinea-Conakry. So many people had different answers. And I think this was also something that angered the investigators, that nobody could tell them precisely where I was. So they felt someone was hiding me. Obviously, the editors were picked up from the Point, Papsen and Ibrahim Sawane. Pamoudou was picked up, but he was also the treasurer of the Gambia Press Union. I think he was invited. Sarata Javidiva, she was the vice president. So even though they were working at the Point, I believe they were picked up because of their links with the GPU and not necessarily because they were working at the Point. So Buya called me. I was in Bamako still, so Buya called and said that the NIA had invited the others for questioning. But I was quite close to Buya, and as I was still the GPU president, he was sort of managing emails and the monitoring tools and stuff like that. So I said, just pack everything and leave. Initially, he said, where do I go? So I said, let me think. But in the meantime, can you go to my auntie's house? Because I don't think they will think of looking at you there, or looking for you there. But I just got into overdrive mode and started calling friends that I have within the BBC, the CNN, and other major news networks, so that information would go out. I also called media rights groups, Article 19, the Media Foundation. So the information got out the very same day that they were arrested, and this was why they were arrested. So from day one, we had started working on this. I also contacted a lawyer from day one. I was very concerned about Sarata because whilst I was president of the GPU or Secretary General, I already had a son. And I used to bring my child to the office. So I encouraged women who had babies to bring their babies to work so that they would not have the stress of thinking of breastfeeding and other issues. So like me, Sarata was almost always with her baby. So she was taken with the baby. And the first day I did not talk to them. I had contacted Lawyer Lamin Kamar, but the first day I don't believe I had access to them. Possibly until 3 days later, I did not have access to them. But when I did, I spoke to Sarata first, and I told her, don't let go of your baby, because I'm going to mount an international campaign on your baby, and he's going to get you out of there, so don't ever let them get hold of your baby. And during all this, I must say that within the security forces and other state institutions, we always had people who were kind of like sympathetic to the GPU cause, and who would enable communications between me and other GPU members. But at that point in time, you could not say that because it meant putting other people in trouble. So I would communicate with Sarata quite frequently.
I want to ask you a question about what your objective, or what was the purpose of writing this press release, and then juxtaposing that with the reaction that you received, whether you understand what happened there.
As indicated earlier, the press release had two objectives. One, to remind the head of state that no matter what he said, he was still the head of state and therefore responsible for instructing the relevant authorities to investigate the death of Data. And that two, no matter how many times he told us not to talk about this, we were going to talk about it, because this was us. Data was us. There was no separating the two. So this was the main motivation behind the letter.
What do you think about, what was it about the letter you think that angered the state to take such measures?
Well, I believe it was seen to be a direct attack on the president, because it was addressed to him. And at that point in time, beyond Data's, and I think this was also my thinking when I was writing, I felt that because Data said Mr. President so many times, he was eliminated. So I was actually also going to provoke him by saying, Mr. President, Mr. President. I think in the editing, a lot of Mr. Presidents came out, because in every paragraph I decided to start with Mr. President. But my colleagues felt maybe that was way too personal, so we did edit some of it. But for me, this was GPU and Jame, and we had to just take the bull by its horns and deal with the consequences. On the reaction, I knew there would be some, that it would be that huge. I did not. So maybe I underestimated him. Oh, I underestimated the state, yeah.
But you knew enough to concede to your colleagues when they suggested toning down the language?
Well, certainly. If I was underground, possibly not. But because I was away, I also had to think of their concerns, also about their personal security. So, yes, I had to concede. But as I said, I wrote this in the middle of the night, and very, very unhappy about the remarks of the president.
So I want to make sure that the names are clear in the record of the GPU-7. So I'm just looking again at your statement, and it's Pap Sen, managing editor of the Point newspaper, Ibrahima Sawane, editor of the Point newspaper, Sam Sar, editor of Foria, Abubakar Saidi Khan, reporter for Foria. You also mentioned Emil Toure, who was the Secretary General of GPU, an assistant editor at Foria. You also mentioned Sarata Javi Dibba, who was vice president of GPU and columnist at the Point newspaper. Yeah. And then Pa Modou Fall, who was treasurer and reporter at the Point newspaper. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Those are the 7. You also told us that you engaged in a campaign to put international pressure on the government. Yeah. Can you tell, you already told us some of the institutions and organizations you contacted. What was the result of that particular case? What happened in the end, as far as you know?
Well, I'll talk briefly on what we did first. As I was in Bamako, I contacted the National Union of Journalists, UNAJOM, and we held a press conference the very first day. Then I went to Dakar that evening or the next morning, because I felt maybe in Dakar I was closer. and organized a televised press conference in Dakar with the Senegalese Press Union, SEMPIX, and the Editors Forum of Senegal. I had meetings with, I believe he was at the time a Minister of Information of Senegal. And before I left Bamako also, I had a meeting with the Foreign Minister because I wanted to use ECOWAS pressure on Jammeh to release the journalists. So from Dakar, I had a meeting with Buya, had some meetings with some ambassadors, then I went to Abuja. I had a meeting with the president of the ECOWAS Commission at the time. I traveled, I believe, with the Amnesty International staff. And then we went to Accra. This all happened in the space of 1 week. We went to Accra, and I had meetings with civil society groups and met with some women's rights groups in Accra. In Abuja, I had spoken to the chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission, who gave me a very good perspective for the campaign on Baby Mohammed. And he told us that we had to get the women's rights group. So when I went to Accra, this is what I did, to write a protest letter to the AU to indicate that in Gambia, if you're a journalist and a woman, your children could actually end up in prison too, which we did. And it was signed by some 50-something women's rights groups. And we also decided to have a send a diaper campaign to Baby Mohammed in prison so that we would flood Mile 2 prisons with diapers, because it was not a place for babies, right? So I was like moving around the sub-region, talking to lawyers on the ground, raising funds, but doing interviews every day. Like,
You were still in communication with your colleagues who were in prison at that time, or had they already been bailed?
mainly through the lawyer. No, they were not, like, before their bail. I did not want this. I guess for the third day, possibly they appeared in a court. Yes. So this was the first time I spoke to them when they appeared in court, through a family member, I believe. And then much later it would have been through lawyer Camara, and then other lawyers came on board, and Ndey and others. So the legal bill, you can imagine, was quite massive. So I was doing different things at the same time. I believe I had to send Buya to travel on my behalf in some instances. But the PR was very important for me, so I would actually call myself the BBC and ask them to interview me, which, because I have friends working there, they did. And they would also speak to colleagues in CNN and other major networks to interview me. And I remember one of the detainees told me once when we talked on the phone that they actually tell them, can you please tell Ndey to keep quiet? If she does, we're going to actually release you. Like, the head of state is really upset that she's talking so much. So when I knew that that was a problem, I decided to do an interview every day. So I believe I did interviews every day for almost 3 months.
Did you at any point during that time consider going back home?
Yes.
During that period?
Yeah, within the first 3 days. Actually, when I was in Dakar, I spoke to lawyer Camara and said that he should negotiate for their release. If I turn myself in, would they be released? And he thought that was the most ridiculous idea. And he said, I don't believe so. But we're lucky that you're outside because you can make as much noise as possible. And I said, well, I want to discuss with my colleagues as well, which he facilitated. And they also agreed with the advice of the lawyer that I should actually stay away and mount a campaign. But yes, this was my intention when I was going to Dakar.
So what eventually happened to that case against the lawyers and the efforts that you were making at PR in order to get them released? What happened eventually?
Well, they were eventually sentenced and convicted, sentenced to 2-year terms, I think, and a fine of $200,000 or so, which, if not paid, would be commuted to another 2-year sentence. And so the lawyer, but he did tell me, he said, we'll do our best, but I'm sure they will be convicted. He did tell me from the beginning. So mount a campaign, that's the only thing I can tell you, because Jammeh doesn't like pressure. So when they were fined, he asked, what about the fine? I said, I'm not paying a dime. because I know they'll be out. He said, "You sure?" I said, if they last 1 year in prison, I'll throw myself in. Because I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I wasn't going to. So long as they were in there, I had to do something. So eventually, they were pardoned on a Ramadan evening, and Jammeh claims that it was in the spirit of Ramadan, but I think everybody knows that it was because of the pressure.
So you felt that international pressure was the only way to bring to bear on Jammeh to actually release those individuals before the end of their prison term?
Certainly. I believe I wrote possibly 20 letters to the ECOWAS and AU during this period. I met several heads of state. I met Thabo Mbeki. He was no longer head of state. I met anyone and everyone that I thought could prevail on him to leave journalists alone, and I made sure that I painted a true picture of what was happening. So this was not just, and I discovered at this point in time that many leaders did not actually know what was happening in the Gambia. So beyond talking about the journalists and the grim human rights record, I just decided to paint a real picture of what was happening in the Gambia at that time.
During that that particular incident and the charges, were you charged at any point during that time?
I believe so. Seriously, my coping mechanism was to block issues as soon as I dealt with them. So there are many things that I could not remember, and you had to force me to remember and to research on. So this for me was really not about me. But I don't believe so. I'm not sure. I can't remember.
I believe this would be a good time to stop because we will talk about some of what happened to you while you were outside, some of the things that happened to you while you were outside the Gambia. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, if the commissioners want to ask a few questions in the last couple of minutes, I leave it to you. Otherwise, we can take a break. Thank you.
Thank you, Council, and thank you, Madam Sosseh. We will hold our questions until the end of our testimony, and at this moment, we will take a 30-minute break and come back at 12 noon. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.